You know, us modern types like to think of a black neighborhood here and a white neighborhood here. It was nothing like that in South Philadelphia. People lived side by side or across alleys that were so narrow that somebody could reach out and touch the buildings on both sides.
Across Philadelphia, the tangled web of alleys below South Street is the poorest neighborhood. Jammed with tens of thousands of Irish famine refugees, their neighbors, the many descendants of escaped slaves. Together in Moyamensing, all live under the eye of a man called the Squire, William McMullen.
He starts out as a tough guy. In the Bible riots of 1844, some people think he was involved in the shooting of the first Protestant who died in those riots.
McMullen is one of a bunch of bully boys who is protecting Catholic churches. And he goes on from there to become a window bookman for the Democratic Party, the friend of Irish voters, to affirm to the judge of elections that Billy O'Shea or James Kerrigan is definitely a resident of Philadelphia, has lived here all his life, for at least 5 or 10 years, and is a legitimate voter.
That means you vote the way he wants you to vote, you turn out when he wants you to turn out, you become part of his team, his machine.
The engine that drives his machine is the Moyamensing Hose Company, the city's 27th fire brigade.
The fire companies weren't run out of City Hall. They weren't municipal. They were independent entities that protected their own neighborhoods. Not only very good at fighting fires, but truly McMullen's paramilitary to expand and defend his political power.
We sometimes forget why corruption could flourish as readily as it did. People like William McMullen got jobs done.
He could get your street repaired. He could help get your loved one out of jail. He knew the prison guards. He'd gotten them their jobs.
The Irish immigrants, despite settling in the slums, the fact that they can vote means they can matter to McMullen. And if they matter to McMullen, they can get ahead.
Directly across 7th Street, at the First African Presbyterian Church, Reverend William Catto, who was born a slave, puts his faith in the rising generation. Catto's son, Octavius, bristles with ambition.
William Catto knows that his son, Octavius V. Catto, has what it takes to be one of the greatest men of Philadelphia, black or white. He decides to send him to the very best school that he can, the Institute for Colored Youth.
The Institute had a history of its own. Well-intended Quakers wanted it as a school where kids would be taught trades, would be taught the garden, would be taught the farm. Well, men like William Catto, Octavius's father, would not stand for it.
They're saying this is what we want, not to be pushed aside to receive an agricultural education. They want the classics.
The generation of students who went to the Institute for Colored Youth in the 1850s, they were totally energized. People were clearly feeling that this was the moment.
They were going to come out of there able to stand up and argue on their feet, to run a classroom, to deliver a sermon, to give a political speech, to become a lawyer or a doctor. It was revolutionary.
Students Jacob White and Octavius Catto lobby for a visit by Pennsylvania Governor James Pollock. To their surprise, he shows up. But in his speech, he ignores the issue they care about most.
Jacob Clement White Jr. stands up and interrupts him. And he addresses the governor in the flowery, respectful language of the day.
Because of a state law, no black man has been able to vote in Pennsylvania in nearly 20 years. Jacob White demands, when will our voting rights be restored?
The governor looks startled, and he kind of hems and haws, but he doesn't really answer the question that Jake White is asking.
White stands up again and he makes this statement. We here at the Institute for Colored Youth, we have been preparing for that day when you are ready to talk about racial equality. We will be ready.
Who were these colored youth who were aspiring to more than white Irish immigrant families might be able to expect? The one thing which keeps this from going lethal is the fact that blacks cannot vote. And being politically powerless means ward leaders like William McMullen let some tensions simply simmer.
In the mid-1850s, Philadelphia's fortunes were at a pretty low ebb. Lost trade to New York. It had been visited by riot after riot. Philadelphians are desperate to restore their city's commercial and financial prosperity.
In a race to reach the West, Philadelphia is trapped by an outmoded system of canals. The city struggles to keep up with New York and Baltimore.
Many merchants and civic leaders in Philadelphia were in a blind panic. It took about 4 days to go across the state from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Canal boats only moved at 3 or 4 miles an hour, as fast as a person could walk.
The founders of the Pennsylvania Railroad lure the best engineer in the nation, John Edgar Thompson. His team will cut the Pittsburgh route from 4 days to 14 hours.
These are engineers. They mean to fix problems, topple mountains, straighten curves, engineer a new kind of city, a new world, and make a lot of money while doing it.
Thompson moves west from Pittsburgh, integrating smaller railroads into the burgeoning Pennsylvania system.
Philadelphians want that railroad to extend all the way to the Pacific, to capture the trade of the continent and to bring it back to Philadelphia.
The Pennsylvania Railroad becomes the railroad of the industrial heartland of North America.
The railroads really saved the city economically. You go from carriages and horses to steam engines, those wonderful inventions that really altered the American economic landscape. Matthias Baldwin, the world's largest locomotive manufacturer, was right at Broad and Spring Garden Streets.
Thompson had done this miraculous thing. He finally overcame the advantage that New Yorkers had with the Erie Canal. That suddenly makes the Pennsylvania Railroad the most significant, most powerful, and wealthiest company in Philadelphia.
Just a short walk from Thompson's office, William Still must engineer an even more complex system.
Officially, William Still was a clerk and janitor at the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He makes $3.75 a week. But at night, he's a conductor on the northern terminus of the Eastern Line of the Underground Railroad.
Still is no different from a railroad engineer of the time, as he's precise, careful, building a system much like Thompson. And yet he's braver than Thompson. He's in a very risky business.
Still's business, conducting escaped slaves to freedom.
This was about his family. This was about his mother and father both escaping from slavery, his mother escaping twice, sent back the first time with her children, and on her second escape, she could only come with 2 of her children, leaving the others behind.
What he did was to chronicle every single story. As a runaway came to Philadelphia, the first stop was William Still.
The term Underground Railroad for Still was a way to make people think about travel, an actual line that you could follow that would lead you to freedom. It's not simply just that North Star, but if people could imagine themselves traveling on a railroad, that for them would be a symbol of hope.
But with 4 million Americans enslaved, William Still can hardly rest.
It was against the law to harbor fugitives. The Times demanded that his activities were covert and secretive, because he would be dead.
On the train to his inauguration in Washington, President-elect Abraham Lincoln stops at Independence Hall. The Philadelphians who greet him there are apprehensive. 7 southern states have responded to Lincoln's opposition to slavery by seceding from the Union.
At that moment, in the shadow of Independence Hall, he says this: "I've often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept us so long together. There was something in that declaration giving liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time, and that all should have an equal chance. But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender it."
In the spring of 1861, when Southern militias fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston, Philadelphia mobilizes for civil war. Stalwart Democrat William McMullen defies pro-Southerners in his own party.
The issue was no longer, are we for or against slavery? It was more like, we all believe in the Union, and people really did. McMullen led a whole unit of soldiers, mostly men from his host company.
Was Philadelphia really a northern city or a southern city? From the very beginning, Southern families liked Philadelphia. Streets around the old Independence Hall area where these Southern families lived in predominance. There was a Carolina row, there was a Georgia row, a Virginia row.
Philadelphia's most influential families are split on the question of the war's goal to end slavery. Many of them are deeply invested in cotton in the South, through railroads or through plantations that they own. And that economy is going to be wrecked if slavery is destroyed.
But to J. Edgar Thompson, slavery has no place in an efficient, modern society. He can't bear those calling on President Lincoln to compromise. He soon finds he isn't alone. Dozens, then hundreds of men throw their weight behind a new political force, the Union League. With Thompson's help, the League launches a recruitment drive for black troops. Graduates of the Institute for Colored Youth will lead the charge, including the son of Reverend William Catto.
Octavius V. Catto exemplified the best and the finest qualities of his generation. He excelled in sports. He excelled in academics. He excelled in community leadership. He was the future perfect for the African American community.
When Southern armies had worked their way all the way to the Pennsylvania border, Catto rallies his students at the Institute for Colored Youth to take them to Harrisburg on the train and sign them up for the Union armies.
But as the war rages on, Philadelphia will now receive the wounded by the thousands. Some 24 military hospitals with more than 10,000 beds. Those are in addition, of course, to the 22 civilian hospitals that are used to treat the war wounded. Philadelphia becomes the Union Triage Center.
At Mauer War Hospital in Chestnut Hill, the rush of the wounded has created a new demand for nurses and doctors, inspiring 16-year-old Anna Broomall.
Young men have the army to enlist in. They can sign up, grab a rifle, throw on a uniform, and go fight. Young women have a different kind of a problem. How do they find their way into this event that's going to define their generation. How can they sit on the sidelines? Of course they can't.
Anna Brumall tells her father, "I'm gonna be a doctor." And he says, "You better be a good one."
With Philadelphia factories feeding the Union arsenal, the men of Frankfort, Kensington, and Moyamensing overwhelmed the rebel army. Victorious Union League men prepare their new headquarters on Broad Street in anticipation of the ribbon cutting by President Lincoln in 3 weeks.
April 22nd, 1865. The Lincoln funeral train came in along the line of the Pennsylvania Railroad, drawn through the streets of Philadelphia by 8 horses. And the crowds pack the sidewalks, as many as 500,000 people.
The members of the Union League were given the honor of receiving the body of Lincoln at Independence Hall.
Even the young Democrats of Philadelphia marched in mourning.
The man who managed to unite William Still and J. Edgar Thompson, Octavius Catto, and William McMullen is now gone.
Now the boys' principal of the Institute for Colored Youth, Octavius Catto, has fallen in love with his former classmate, Caroline LeCount.
They want full and equal civil rights, and they want it now.
LeCount sets an immediate target: Philadelphia's streetcar operators. The privately held streetcar companies assert no black riders allowed.
Black people who tried to take a seat in the cars were typically confronted with the N-word. They were set upon by the conductor.
If the Civil War was successful, why can't we ride the streetcar? We have a right to ride the streetcar.
Picking up a campaign spearheaded by William Still, Octavius Catto brings a bill to Harrisburg prohibiting discrimination on the streetcar lines. With Republican support, the bill passes. But Caroline LeCount knows that a law is no guarantee.
She's a Philadelphian. She understands that the law is only the law. Caroline LeCount decides to risk her own safety to test that law.
As she attempts to board a car at 11th and Lombard,
We don't allow your kind.
the conductor's response is all too familiar.
Well, Caroline LeCount marches straight to a magistrate at City Hall, brings a complaint against the streetcar conductor and his company.
Acting on LeCount's information, the magistrate sends officers out to arrest the conductor.
Caroline LeCount and Anna Brumall, they've grown up at a time where they're impatient to wait for change to happen. They want to make the change happen for themselves.
At 8th and Pine, women's medical college student Anna Brumall is told she cannot be a surgeon. Women aren't allowed.
We are dealing with Victorian codes of behavior and conduct, and so the male students in the class felt it highly inappropriate that women were being exposed to this type of thing.
Pressured by Anna Brumall and other students, in 1869, the dean, Anne Preston, stands up to the medical establishment and demands that her students be admitted to surgery clinic.
They're also very much inheritors of this tradition of women in the city of Philadelphia who have put their bodies on the line for change.
On the first day, male students greet the women with spitballs and catcalls.
Anna Brumall puts up with all that stuff and keeps coming. She ends up having a career for decades in a pioneering clinic.
As Broomall and her colleagues observe their first surgery, Congress passes the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, finally granting black men the right to vote. In Moyamensing, Octavius V. Catto prepares to register hundreds of new voters.
A tidal wave of new black voters will doom Democratic rule in Philadelphia. They were registered Republicans, unlike McMullen.
The Democrat William McMullen smells a challenge. Republicans have promised to disband the Moyamensing Hose Company and all volunteer companies in favor of a professional fire department.
He knows that his authority is liable to come tumbling down by abolishing the volunteer fire companies that really abolishes the political power base through which ward leaders like William McMullen had long been able to operate.
All these new black voters and their leader, the face of the movement, Octavius Catto, are right in the face of William McMullen.
McMullen and his firemen are under the protection of Democratic mayoral candidate James Biddle. But Biddle doesn't have the numbers to win, so McMullen decides he must suppress the African-American vote.
With the election just 12 hours away, McMullen's men fan out across Moyamensing.
By noon on Election Day, with Catto at the Institute for Colored Youth teaching, Moya men and their allies in the police department have shot half a dozen black people.
Octavius Catto goes to the office of Mayor Daniel Fox and begs for the city to intervene. But Fox, a Democrat, has no interest in protecting black voters. So he turns to Catto and says, "You'd better protect yourself."
He goes to 3rd and Walnut and buys a gun. It has no bullets in it. And he starts walking back home.
On South Street, Catto sees a streetcar filled with black and white riders. Another man sees Octavius V. Catto.
He's got a number tattooed on the back of his hand, and it's the number 27.
Octavius V. Catto is one of 6 black men shot dead on Election Day. 6 days later, Republicans remember him with the city's largest public funeral since Abraham Lincoln.
His remains are taken back to the Institute for Colored Youth, the school that he helped to run. And people from the neighborhood came that night to pay their respects and gathered around that schoolhouse right there at 9th and Bainbridge. It's still there today. And encircled that building as if to embrace it and protect it.
In the coming years, Caroline LeCount will be the first black woman hired as a principal in the Philadelphia Public Schools. She will lead the O.V. Catto School. Victorious Republicans finally abolished the city's 72 volunteer fire companies. But the leader of the Moyas is undaunted. 2 Octobers after the murder of Octavius Catto, William McMullen wins election to a seat on City Council, where he will serve for nearly 30 years.